to Winnipeg down here that I found that the color of my skin really mattered, and it still continues to matter. Um, it seems to be when I first got here quite important, the fact that I was an Indigenous person, and it wasn't that important to me in that I knew who I was, and that it was more important for me to be a human being, albeit an Indigenous person who is a human being. And but people here, it was far more important that um, what the color of my skin was, and and um, and that was one of the things that I've had to learn well, and really fast. Having been living in Winnipeg now for well over 30 years, it's still something that I don't get used to, or that I haven't gotten used to, and it has been quite the difficult road sometimes, walking down the street and being called all kinds of things, you know, even having things thrown at me occasionally, and um, people threatening, just because I am an Indigenous person. And it's hard to explain that sometimes because there's so much emotion behind that. And not only that, but it I'm not sure if a lot of people get it. And especially when I talk about it in the church, it seems like it's a subject that really makes people uncomfortable. And but I do know that we have to continually talk about this, um, if we are to heal. Um, but not only those of us who are persons of color need to heal, but it's the non-Indigenous people as well that are hurting, and that need to heal as well. Jimmy, I think you're here now, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm here.
Okay, take it away.
Great. So I think what I'll need you to do as the host is if you can enable screen sharing. So on the if you go hover your mouse over the where it says share screen on the top right button, um, you have to enable where participants can share screen simultaneously. If you could do that, for me, then I could share my PowerPoint.
I,
And then, yeah,
I think Rick is going to do that.
okay, great. Yeah, whoever is the host.
Yeah,
And
he's
then
the techie guy here.
and then for everyone else, if you just want to click on speaker view on the top right corner of your screen, there's speaker view or gallery view. If you want to go ahead and click on speaker view, then that will put me as the center of your screen. And if you want to take it a step further, you can go to on the top right, it also says enter full screen, or you can press Alt F. And that just makes it easier for everyone to see the PowerPoint when I share it. And so just gonna double check to see. Yeah, looks like we're good to go for that. And I'll start the show from the beginning. Okay, so is everyone seeing it? Vince, does it look good to you? Oh, you're muted there, Vince.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, looks good to you?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll begin. So yeah, thanks for having me, and yeah, really excited and looking forward to sharing a bit of a presentation on racism and the church. So what I thought I would focus on today is something that's a little bit more practical. I've done a lot of work, both just being an Indigenous person, but also being invited into different spaces where I would solve problems. And so I decided to focus this presentation on things that people would find practically useful in not only their churches, but also charities, parachurch organizations, and just looking how different denominations are structured, and solving problems and addressing issues. And so blending a little bit of my MBA background with my ministry background. So just start just explaining a little bit about who I am. I'm an adjunct professor at Horizon College and Seminary. I teach Indigenous ministry, and I do that about once a year. They're talking about increasing that a little bit, and due to interest. The great thing about the university is this is now a required course for anybody who's graduating and stepping into ministry. I'm also a treasurer and advisory committee member at Circles for Reconciliation. And if you're not familiar with that organization, it's a great opportunity to get 10 people together, 5 Indigenous, 5 non-Indigenous, and just have 10 discussions for 10 different weeks on reconciliation and different themes related to reconciliation. Great way to build relationships and just to talk through things, because sometimes you need to process it as a group and through conversation and through relationship. I'm a co-founder of Reconciliation Thunder. That's if you go to Facebook, you can just do a search for Reconciliation Thunder. The goal here is just to use social media and social media campaigns as a means of explaining the basics of reconciliation to as many people as possible. I'm a public speaker on topics related to treaties, reconciliation, and as a result of that, I've become a consultant. It's become something that I've not officially sort of set out to do, but as a result of the different presentations and being invited into different spaces, I've worked with different churches, church boards, organizations, and just solved problems related to cultural awareness, conflict resolution, reconciliation themes, racism, and that kind of a thing. So it's just sort of organically happened. I'm also working as an economic and business development officer, so supporting our different First Nations with different economic development provinces here in Manitoba. So that's what I do. In terms of who I am, I think it's a lot of Indigenous people, well, your identity is tied to, who you're related to, where you're from, and that kind of a thing. And so my family is from Sachigo Lake, Ontario. And I'm going to show you these pictures of these 4 men here. These are my relatives. And starting on the left, the gentleman that looks like me that's my late father. And this is a photo when was really close to my age. And to his right is my grandfather. He's holding my youngest sister, who is now just recently got married. And to his right is his father. So that's my great grandfather, Jimmy Thunder, who is he was an Anglican, and everyone followed afterwards was Pentecostal. So Vince likes to joke that we lost our way after that generation. But and then to Jimmy Thunder's right is his son Andrew Thunder, which is I guess my great uncle, and my brother is named after him. And so all these men were men who went to church regularly. Their faith was really essential to them. It was really important for them to follow the teachings of the Bible, and so that is sort of where we sort of it's part of my identity, and my faith has been part of my identity for at least these generations. So that's where I am. And if we're going to be talking about racism, then we got to start by asking about why does it matter, And so we have here a famous painting that is depicting the residential school experience, and very poignantly. So when people are thinking about our church and our Christian faith from an outside perspective, they might ask us questions such as these on the right. Do you know what your church has done? Do you know what your church isn't doing? As if colonialism has somehow stopped at some point in history and its effects have stopped. And what not only what has the church done, but what is it not doing presently to address some of these issues? And questions like, why should I go to your church? And why should I believe in your God? And so these questions are really important, not only for explaining to people outside the church about who we are and about who God is and what the scriptures say, but even for us, if we're to be intellectually honest, and if we are to be people of faith and trying to be people after God's own heart, then we should really step into the uncomfortable waters of trying to wrestle with some of these questions, specifically as it results to racism and the lack of addressing racism. So first step is to know the history. And so I'm going to try to give you a synopsis. I'm going to give you 500 years of history in about 10 minutes. And so the best way to do that, I think, is to use this framework that I borrowed from the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples. And so in these 4 different boxes, this relates to the 4 different stages from the RCAP report. And what I did underneath is I defined them through the lens of treaty. So here, the first, we have treaties between our nations, or sorry, it's the other way around. So in the brackets below, those are the terms from the RCAP. So they begin with separate worlds, nation-to-nation relations, respect gives way to domination, and renegotiation and renewal. And so what I thought a good way to really summarize our history, the 500-year history in these 10 minutes, is to look at it through the lens of treaty. So I chose the terms treaties between our nations, treaties with settlers, broken treaties, and then reconciliation. And so if we're looking at our history in these 4 stages, the first one I want to highlight is treaties between our nations. And what I want to do to describe this phase is to really attack that myth that we were just wandering savages and that we didn't have structured societies and that we didn't have our own governments and that kind of a thing. And there's been a lot of talk in terms of how to address that. And I think one of the best presentations that I've heard in this topic so far is a presentation done by Aaron Mills on the Treaty of Niagara and Anishinaabe constitutionalism. And so you could find his presentation on episode 15 and 16 of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, which is a great resource. This is part of the Let's Talk Treaty series, and great resource for knowing more about the treaty relationship and the meaning of the words "we are all treaty people." So what he's talking about with Anishinaabe constitutionalism, it's actually a really clever way of taking the teachings of our elders and these descriptions of what life was like pre-contact and in terms of how our society was structured, and not only translating it into English, but taking it a step further and using words like constitutionalism, which have years of thought and research associated with it, in order to describe what our societies were like. And so some of the basics of Anishinaabe constitutionalism is the idea of mutual aid, the idea of, the structure of working together to support ourselves, and respect for each other, respect for the environment. And this included treaties. So treaties between our nations were an extension of this Anishinaabe constitutionalism, this idea that we do life better together. And so I want to use that to paint the picture of what this first stage in history is. So this is pre-contact. So now in the next stage, this is post-contact. So peaceful nation-to-nation relations. And that's when First Nations start to make treaties with European nations. And so what I have pictured here is the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which is a treaty that was made between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And the 2 lines represent 2 rivers, which represents 2 boats that will go on the river. And the 2 of them will move on for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river, the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow without touching or harming each other. So 2 nations doing life together. And so that's a good symbol and example of what these nation-to-nation relationships look like and what treaties were between First Nations and settlers. And so, as we move into this first stage, you get into the broken treaties, or when respect gives way into domination. So some might say this happened around Confederation. Some would say it's even present in some of the pre-Confederation provinces. But in any case, this describes a shift away from this peaceful, mutual aid, this extension from Anishinaabe constitutionalism, and this desire for us to do life together. And when you have one side clearly dominating another side. See, with treaties, the idea is, the First Nations were looking into the future, and they're trying to determine how we can move forward peacefully. And that's where we have even as late as the numbered treaties taking place. So one of the mechanisms in which this changed was the creation of the Indian Act. And so, in 1871, 72, 73, 74, and 75, you have treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So right in the middle of this process where Canada is creating these nation-to-nation treaties, they roll out this Indian Act, which is completely one-sided. It's unilaterally imposed and enforced, and that rolls out in 1876. So right in the middle of this treaty-making process, and they continue to make more treaties afterwards. And an example of just how draconian this act is, I'm giving you an example of one of the policies, which is the pass system. So on the bottom left of the screen, it shows an example of a pass. And so First Nations people were not allowed to leave their reserve without having a pass signed. And so what they did was, as an example here, the bearer, his name is John Constant. This is pass number 4. His band is the Cumberland Band with their number, for 22 days with one gun to visit the residential school, and his business was to visit his children, Duck Lake Agency. So you could imagine that, First Nations people all across Canada had to fill out these passes just to visit their children. It's an incredibly difficult act to live under. And so even today, we still live under this Indian Act. Policies have been changed and revised, but this represents the breaking away of this idea of doing life together, and rather one that clearly shows one as the dominant nation in the relationship and others being subversive. And so this last stage is reconciliation or renegotiation and renewal, to use the RCAP terminology. And so this is when we're sort of beginning to realize what went wrong and how to make things better, and how to do things right. And so we talked in this conference about themes of repentance, and this is also as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the RCAP report itself, and that type of thing, where we're beginning to shift away from that and move towards exploring what right relationship looks like. And so going back to what these nation-to-nation ships originally were meant to be. So this is a quick snapshot of the history. This is a good sort of overarching meta-narrative to help understand the relationship. And it's good to know this piece at least, but the more we can dig into this, and the more that people can be aware of this and be knowledgeable of this, the more we could move forward together. So the past here is really important for us to shape and dictate how our future looks. So with that in place, I think that one of the most important things when we're addressing racism is to define what it actually is. That's sort of the core. That's where you start. And I would even say that if you're arriving at the right definition of racism with an intellectually honest person, it's almost the entire battle, because that's, if the person's intellectually honest, and if you're defining racism appropriately, then things are going to be that much easier. So what is racism? How do most people define it? Well, racism, Noun, racism. A bunch of terrible things that do not describe me in any way, shape, or form. So this is sort of like the average person, when they're thinking about racism, it's the unspoken assumptions. And so where am I getting that from? It's because people use different arguments to describe how racism does not apply to them. So as an example, you hear people say things like, I don't hate people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, etc. Therefore, I am not racist. Or, I have Black friends. Therefore, I am not racist. Or, I have given money, support, gifts, etc. To Black, Indigenous people of color. Therefore, I am not racist. Or this other one, I am a Christian. Therefore, I am not racist. And so these types of arguments are fairly strong, or very common. There are a lot of people that would, use these. You come across these on a daily basis of people saying like, because of these things, I'm not racist. And so if you revert back, and if you take a step back and create a definition of racism from these arguments, you get something that looks a little bit like this. So a racist then would be defined as a person who does not profess Christianity or its teachings, and who expresses hatred toward people of other ethnicities through actions such as refusing to befriend or provide any type of support. So, of course, I mean, this is not an accurate definition of what racism is at all. In fact, this definition is, once you actually take those arguments, take a step back and you recreate a definition, you realize that these excuses are from people who don't actually have a good understanding of what racism is and what we're talking about. And so any conversation about racism becomes ineffective because they're not defining racism properly. So the first one, that was a definition of racist. And so then following the same logic, what is the definition of racism? The hatred of people of other ethnicities expressed by the refusal to make friends or to provide any type of support. And so, yeah, obviously this is inaccurate. And so what is the actual definition of racism? So if we are to look at some dictionary definitions, you have some of these, for example. So Merriam-Webster, it talks about how race is a fundamental determinant of human traits, right? So the idea that whatever race you're from will determine some of your actual physical traits, or racism could be the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social and economic political advantage of another. Could be a political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. So racism then is not just an attitude, but it's also a political or social system. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail on these definitions, but just to highlight some of the things that these dictionary definitions are saying. So racism then, according to Collins Co-Build, is a belief. So it's a belief that some people of some races are inferior to others. And here in the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, this is the last one I want to show. And I think this is probably one of my favorite ones because it goes into a level of detail that I like. It's the inability or refusal to recognize the rights, the needs, and the dignity or value of people of particular races or geographic origins. More widely, it's the devaluation of various traits of character or intelligence as typical of particular peoples. And the category of race may itself be challenged. So the idea that race should even be used at all. We're all part of the human race, and the genetic differences between different ethnicities are so small that the argument is that it doesn't really warrant the use of the word race. So these are all definitions of racism, and you can see that it's a lot deeper than just hating somebody of a particular race. So I need to say that again. A lot of people would think of racism as an overt categorical hatred, and I would, by looking through these dictionary definitions, it's not simply an overt categorical hatred. It's all these other elements. It's the thought um, and unexpressed assumptions that people carry with them. That is actually what racism is. And here's a question then. So that being the definition of racism, would racism be considered a sin? And so a lot of people would find this question challenging, and a lot of people would actually refuse to even explore this question because it's an uncomfortable question. Is racism a sin? And I think that no matter how hard, no matter how it's defined, whether you use any of these, the definitions we used above, however you choose to define racism, it's not hard to make the case that racism is either a sin or it's the result of sins. And I've sort of seen that take place in different conversations, that some people would say, like, it's not a sin in itself, it's just the result of other component sins that lead it to becoming a sin. And so I think that that thinking again is problematic, and it's just people sort of skirting around the question. So many Christians prefer to think that they prefer to think of racism as a result of sins rather than a sin in itself. So why is that? Why do people prefer to think of it as a result of sins? I would make the case that any sin can be broken down into its constituent sins. Whatever sin that you're talking about, it's whether it's the result of sins or it's a sin, they can all be broken down into their constituent sins, and so they should be treated the same. So that leads us to a discussion of this word, racist. And so here's a definition: a word so terrible it applies to almost nobody. And so what I mean with this, by this definition, is that as the usage of the word racist has increased, so has the aversion to being associated with the term. And so if you look at this chart here, or just after the 1948 slot, you can start to see that the usage grows. But at the very same time, what also grows is the fact that people are recognizing that a racist is just a terrible person and nobody wants to be associated with it. And so you would think that if people are hating the word, that they would also be hating what the word is describing. But the problem is that that's not the case. We've come to hate the word without hating the problem that the word describes. And so that leads to this whole problem. That's actually the root cause of this whole problem of semantics that I've been covering up until this point. People are finding ways to ensure that the word racist or racism doesn't apply to them, because everyone agrees that it's a terrible word. Everybody doesn't want to have it associated with them, but nobody wants to deal with the root cause. They would rather focus on determining how the word does not apply to them. And so that would free them of any actions that they would need to take as a result. So if we're trying to then figure out what the actual definition of racism is, you have to think even a step deeper. So I have three questions here. What about unconscious biases? What about microaggressions? And what about prejudices? Are these considered part of the problem of racism? And just to clarify, first of all, what unconscious biases are. So unconscious biases are, as it says here, they're pervasive. We all have unconscious bias. They're often in our personal bias blind spots. And so unconscious biases are when we look at people of different races, we will have different assumptions about who they are and what they do. We have assumptions about their characters. And we do not have to believe a stereotype in order for it to affect how we make decisions, how we interact with people. And so these are unconscious biases, and we all have them. Microaggressions. So microaggressions are things that we do and we say that affect people of other ethnicities and other races, things that can cause hurt, and things that can be very problematic. And then prejudices. So just having preconceived ideas about people are based on their race without meeting them. So if we are to take all of these different things, unconscious bias, microaggressions, and prejudices, and if we are to agree that these are part of the category and problem of racism, then we recognize that actually racism is a problem that we all struggle with. It's a problem that everybody, who is part of the human race struggles with. And so essentially it's a sin just like any other sin, because as human beings, we are sinful people saved by grace. And we just go through life, recognizing that about our identity. And so whatever theology that we have that addresses our fallen human nature, the sin of racism should fall in exactly with how we treat our other sins. So I want to here talk about the importance of identity, right? Identity versus looking at your sin nature. So on the left-hand side, you see these categories of identity. So racist, alcoholic, liar, glutton. So these are things that describe a person's identity, who that person fundamentally is. And on the right side, you have things that people struggle with. So the sinful nature. So doing or saying racist things, drinking alcohol in excess, not being truthful, eating in excess, these types of things. And so the difference that I want to show here is that when we're talking about racism, there's a huge focus on the identity, the person being a racist, and a lot of arguments trying to focus on convincing somebody that they are a racist. I've seen a lot of those, and I think that those are problematic because you're focusing on the identity of the person rather than the problem of the person's behavior or activity. And I think that the doctrines of propitiation and salvation and grace and those types of things, then we should not focus so much on the person's identity, but rather on that sin nature, and recognizing that we're all in this together and that we all have sinful tendencies as part of our human nature, which include racism. And I think when we begin to tackle it from that end, we start to decrease some of these barriers that have set up, and we start to begin to build these bridges and begin to have some constructive conversations. So here's a question that I've heard in response to this argument. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? And so the quote reads, "What has Jerusalem to do with Athens, the church with the academy, the Christian with the heretic? After Jesus, we have no need of speculation. After the gospel, no need of research." And this was by Tertullian. And so essentially what this quote is saying is, what does Jerusalem represent and what does Athens represent? It's not talking about the actual cities themselves, but Jerusalem is thought to represent faith, the church, Christian thought, etc. And Athens is to do with teaching, philosophy, and that kind of thing. So on a broader term, this quote is saying that philosophy and faith and religion are incompatible. You choose one or you choose the other. And so I've heard this argument in response to what I've said above, in terms of you're taking non-Christian thoughts and philosophies and ways of viewing the world, and you're bringing those into the church and you're bringing those into the Christian faith, specifically in the context of talks to do with reconciliation. And so it's interesting that when you look at the dictionary, right? It's not meant to provide this this defining definition, universally true for all people. It's meant to describe social phenomena in a way that other people can understand and interpret how the world is working. And so if all the writers of the dictionaries are trying to do their due diligence in a non-biased way to describe the social phenomena of racism from a neutral standpoint, then of course you can take that and use that and help that to inform your Christian interpretation of racism, and let that shape your philosophy. And so basically this is a really clever way of basically what it boils down to is, you're saying, by saying what does Jerusalem do with Athens, you're saying what has your dictionary got to do with my Bible. And so when it boils down to the argument that simply, you realize that people are just really doing everything they can to avoid the responsibilities associated with dealing with the sin of racism and talking about it. So why would people go to such levels to try to avoid discussions of racism? Well, it's because people want to believe that we live in a post-racism world. We want to believe that we're already here, or that simply becoming a Christian erases this problem while leaving other sins intact for us to deal with over our lives. So a lot of people, if you listen to the types of arguments of people that are making, in favor of, they would say things like, let's not talk about race, or let's not make it about race, or let's stop pulling the race card, or let's stop talking about identity politics. Like if you listen to what their arguments are, and you try to guess what their presuppositions are, in a lot of cases, it's people that really want to believe we're living in a post-racism world, and that the problems that we see today are not as bad as they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The idea that we've made it already. And so when we talk about racism, people want to fight against the fact that we need to talk about it, because they want to believe that we're already there, that we've made it as a society. Another thing is that we want to believe that we don't need to address sins when doing so would communicate that we subscribe to a social gospel. So I ran into this one quite a bit. The idea that there's a social gospel, and addressing the social needs of society gets in the way of the gospel and the true teachings of Scripture. And so it's a reason for us not addressing certain sins, such as the sin of racism, which we described above. And so the importance here of having the right definition of sin, it leads us to having the right definition of racism, which allows us to deal with things, and not wanting to come across as subscribing to a social gospel is not a valid reason for us looking at the full context of Scripture, including the teachings of justice in the minor prophets. And it's just not a strong and solid argument for not addressing the certain types of sins in our lives. So that's racism. So we're just looking at racism and definition of the word racist. And again, as I say, I think it's more constructive to focus on the word racism rather than racist. But so now, what about institutional racism? So what is institutional racism? What does that mean? And so this is starting to now bridge the conversation to racism in the church in more of a practical level. So institutional racism is a type of racism that has embedded itself into the power structures of society. And so, you have different things such as institutional racism in, learning at institutions, universities, in governments, in the prison system, in the media, in how our news is shaped and prepared and broadcast, but also in the church. And so lately in the context of the George Floyd and what's happened, we've seen all these different institutions share statements in terms of how are they taking a stand against racism? And a lot of times it's examples of them identifying institutional racism in their own areas, and taking a stand to address that, and to make the world a better place. With that being institutional racism. Oh, sorry, there's a question here that says, is institutional racism the same as systemic racism? And yes, they're two different words to describe the same problem. Institutional racism is racism in an institution. Systemic racism is racism in a certain type of system. So yeah, I will feel free to ask questions during the presentation. I'll do my best to try to catch those and respond to them. So absolutely, just feel free to go ahead and do that at any point. You don't have to wait for me to finish. So yes, so that's the definition of institutional racism. So if we're talking in the larger context of racism in Canada, here we have 94 and 46 ways, respectively, to address institutional racism in Canada. When you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they gave us 94 calls to action. If you really look at it, these 94 calls to action, they're broken down into all the different institutions or just different segments of society. And the idea is to give everybody a chance to respond to the call for reconciliation, no matter where you're at. And a lot of these it's essentially addressing institutional racism in all of Canada's different institutions. And so that's the 94 calls to action. If you haven't read them, I recommend that you do have a look through this booklet and choose at least one of them that applies to you. Specifically, those who are in ministry, have a look at the ones related to the church. And here, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So here, these are 46 articles. There's a number of preambular phrases, but these are also 46 ways to address institutional racism. It's more of the government and global level, because the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, it was created by Indigenous peoples all across the world. And it's sort of their unified voice of addressing the issues of colonialism, which leads to institutional racism in our present time. So here you go, 94 and 46 ways to address institutional racism. So when we are now talking about institutional racism in the church, as I mentioned before, I want to be really practical in terms of how we're going to apply this. So I chose just different 5 areas that are common in churches, in organizations, parachurch organizations, or the different ways that denominations are structured. And so again, not looking at it completely from the Anglican lens, but something that can certainly apply to that, but also be useful for everyone else. So again, yeah, theology, operations and governance, teaching and training, corporate culture, and also the programs. So jumping into the first one. So for theology, I don't want to go too much into this because that's what, a lot of the speakers have really touched on this. And, but just to give an example, we talked about terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. So I really want to highlight here this, the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, a Catholic response. I think this is really well written, and it's very open. It's very honest about the history of where terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery came from. So I really recommend that you have if you have a chance, an opportunity to read through this document. It talks about the origin of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. And so, just as a recap, terra nullius comes from the word empty land, and the teaching is that if the indigenous peoples living on a land if they are not farming the land, if they're not using the land, then they can be considered the same as flora and fauna, and the land is essentially up for grabs. And so this was a teaching from the church, and as Dr. Aldred was saying yesterday, it's a way for the church to legitimize the actions of the different countries that were engaging in colonial activities. And so these trace their roots from 3 papal bulls. And papal bulls are just more or less like the statements coming from the Catholic Church. And so you have these 3 that I'm citing here: Dum Diversas, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Caetera. And oh yeah, thanks. It looks like Ryan has sent the link. So yeah, definitely check that out. Save the link. The reason why I'm sharing these 3 papal bulls today is because I want to attach a year to this. I want you to look back and to see like how long ago was this, where did this idea come from, and look at how much it has impacted society and our countries from then until now. So 1452, 1455, and 1493. So if we are to look till today and how that affects us today, there's 2 presentations here that I would like to share. So on the left here we have Johnson versus Mackintosh, and so this is part of what's known as the Marshall Trilogy. And so the link below is a YouTube presentation that was given by Dr. Lindsay Robertson. And so it's one of my favorite sort of explanations of what the Marshall Trilogy is, because at this point, terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery isn't part of our case law. And so the first of the Marshall Trilogy, the Johnson versus Mackintosh case, this is how it moved from being a papal bull to being part of our case law. It started out in the American context, but then it moved over to other countries such as Canada. And so what happened with this case is Johnson, he had purchased a certain tract of land from the Piankashaw tribe, and Mackintosh purchased the same land, but he purchased it from the American government. And so the 2 of them went to court to determine who actually owns this land. And it was actually, so Johnson did this intentionally because he wanted to force a decision. He wanted to force a decision in favor of the Piankashaw. But actually what ended up happening is that the Justice Marshall, he actually used the doctrine of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery to rule in favor of Mackintosh instead. And so what happened was all of the decisions afterward, after the Marshall Trilogy, and even from that point, from 1823 onward, they cited the doctrine of discovery as a legal precedence for deciding future decisions. And so it was a turning point in American history, and because it was part of case law, and because we're part of the Commonwealth, and because of, because it worked its way into Canada as well, it dramatically affected things for the Indigenous peoples of Canada as well. So on the right hand side here, I'm sharing a news release here that was written by the Globe and Mail. And so it's talking about a court case that was run in 2014. And the First Nations were arguing for the right to self-determination in their land, and so the thing that I want to highlight from this decision is the fact that in the doctrine of terra nullius, that no one owned the land prior to European assertion of sovereignty, never applied in Canada. The court said in an 8-0 ruling written by Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin. And so this actually only took place in 2014. So if you just think about that for a second. So this is a 2014 decision. This affected First Nations such as the Wet'suwet'en and a number of First Nations in BC. But just think about that. This is the first time in Canadian history that we have acknowledged in our case law that terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery did not apply here. And so just to go back and to recognize like how far this has gone. So, you know, we have 1452, 1455, 1493, but only now in 2014 are we recognizing that this should not apply in Canada. So this is just an example of how institutional racism from the church can embed itself into other institutions as well. And so there is an interplay, and it can go, it's swung one direction, but it can very easily slide it back. And so it's important for us to see that as a church, as a Christian institution, that we have to be, you know, quote unquote corporate citizens, right? And recognizing that we do have an effect on society, and we can't neglect that, and we can't forget that. So again, in today's context, we talked about a lot of things so far. I just want to highlight 4, because these are sort of 4, I, like in my context, in my experience, some fundamental problems that just keep coming up a lot. Laissez-faire racism. So this is the type of racism that makes the argument that we don't need to do anything. The racism of doing nothing, the racism of just letting things be, you know, laissez-faire, just let it happen, right? So I want to highlight that is a form of racism. It's based on the presupposition that we've already made it. We're living in a post-racism society, and that there's no responsibility on our part to do anything. Colorblind racism is another type of racism. It's very similar to laissez-faire racism, but it's the idea that I don't need to see color, that I don't need to see that, you know, you're Indigenous or you're Black or whatever. It's the idea that we're all one in Christ, and that we you know, and that seeing us as one sort of single race is a good thing. And so the challenge here, in order to explain that, is that if we don't see race, then we don't see how each person connects with the Creator. We don't see how, you know, racism is currently affecting us in society. It closes down dialogue about race, about culture, about systemic racism. It's colorblind racism sounds good, but it's just an avenue of closing down conversations about race. And so anytime somebody says that they don't see color, their heart, they may feel that their heart is in the right place, but that is sort of one of the fundamental things that we need to change. And I'm citing these as kind of like some of the maybe the easier problems to solve, but yeah. Next is the citizens of heaven argument. I touched on this a little bit yesterday. It's the idea that you know, we are the Hagios Ethnos. We are the holy nation. We are to see ourselves as citizens of heaven before members of any other race. And so, like I mentioned yesterday, you know, the argument that we need to stop seeing ourselves as other races is that when we become Christian, that is as ridiculous as saying that when we become Christian, then we need to burn our passports, our Canadian passports, and just forget our Canadian citizenship as well. So it's problematic. The idea that we're one in Christ, same thing, comes from the verse in Galatians that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. So just forgetting the different categories and just assuming that we're one in Christ. So yeah, so just a couple examples. I mean, this one slide can be like an entire conference, right? So, but theology is just one component. But now I wanted to talk about operations and governance. And so if you're looking at how your church or your charity, your ministry, how are you governing it, and what do your operations look like? So here are some ways to address racism in that context. So first of all, looking at your board. So do you have representation on your board, or your elders, or in senior management? And so and then I have this sub question here, do you have at least 3? And so this is coming from some qualitative research that came from an executive search firm called Egon Zehnder. And so what they did is they analyzed boardroom appointments from 1,610 public companies in 44 different countries. And so their research suggests that once you have 3 or more women join a board, that's the point at which a critical mass is reached, whereby women are both more likely to speak and also more likely to be listened to. And so this is a study looking at the equity between genders, but the same research would apply here as well. So the reason for 3 is that, again, if you feel that you have 2 or 3 people, then you feel like you have some people that have your back, so you're more likely to speak. And it's not just the one person. People can support each other. And so regardless of the overall size of the board, 3 seems to be that critical mass. And so my encouragement then would be, 3 people on the board, 3 people guiding. And if an organization is serious about addressing systemic racism, then this is a good place to start, especially if your organization is one that works specifically with a specific people group. For example, if your ministry is working with First Nations people as your primary group that you're helping, then this is important to consider. And so just want to read some of the comments here. So looks like I've been missing a lot. So there's a documentary online. There's a documentary online, The Pass System, for those that want to watch it. It's so powerful. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great documentary. I would agree to check that out. Anglican Church worked on this for all of us to understand more. So yeah, it looks like a great resource. Murray Still wrote that there seems to be resistance in some circles to the phrase Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, but within the Indigenous community, there's an expression, all my relations, along with the medicine wheel teachings that show our colors. Yeah, so absolutely, that's great. So the difference between all lives matter and all my relations, specific response to the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's again part of this whole idea that we live in a post-racist society and that people should stop making it all about race. And so that's where the all lives statement come from. Without the Black Lives Matter statement, there would be no all lives matter movement. And so that's one of the differences between the all my relations statement, the all my relations teaching. So that phrase also moves beyond humanity, right? This idea is talking about how we're also related to the land, we're related to the animals, we're all related. It's the idea that in order to do life well, we need to recognize that we are part of this, just to use European vernacular, we're all part of the ecosystem, And so, and that is a phrase that came on its own. There was, it's not a response to anything. It's just part of Indigenous ways of knowing. It's the original idea before it was translated into English has been passed on for generations and generations. So it's, yeah, definitely a good difference to highlight. It looks like the documentary Doctrine of Discovery, Stolen Land, Strong Hearts has won a Silver Screen Award for the International Film Festival, also has a study guide. Great resource, thanks for sharing that. On national committees of the Anglican Church, there is a policy not always followed that states that there must be at least 2 Indigenous people on committees in the church. Great, that's awesome. That's really great to share. The social gospel has a history of deep racism against even Eastern Europeans and in support of the Indian residential schools. It's not an escape from racism either. Awesome. Thanks, Gwen. Thanks for sharing. So the second point that I have here is, does this representation move beyond tokenism? And so what I mean by tokenism is just a lot of people will have people placed on a board just for the sake of checking off a box. And so it's really important to make sure that their voices are heard, but also, do the checks, double check to ensure that the people who are represented in your organization or in your church, do they feel that what's being shared by this person is representative of their concerns and their experiences? Lastly, do you use the same procedures for dealing with conflict about race as you do with other types of conflict. And so I'll get into this a little bit later in the final slides of the presentation. But there's this idea, there's this concept that it might stem from our unconscious bias, but the idea that you deal with a conflict where race is a key factor differently than you deal with other conflicts. And so the point here is that with whatever policies and procedures you have for resolving a conflict, it should stand exactly the same for those that you have dealing with race. So some of the presuppositions that people might have is that if it's to do with race, you disqualify it because, when it could be like A, because we're Christian, we're not racist, or B, we live in a post-racist society, therefore the person who's bringing the problem forward is the problem itself, so these types of things. So that's what this third point is. If the procedures for dealing with the conflict should be the same as other conflicts. So teaching and training. So a lot of different churches and different programs include teaching and training components, even just different Bible colleges or whatever the organization is doing. If they have components related to teaching and training, they should also include teaching on cultural awareness, microaggressions, unconscious bias, and so on. If they're talking about themes throughout the Bible, just make sure you're being all-inclusive and you're looking at the full context of Scripture. For example, themes of justice found in the Minor Prophets, they could be applied to the current Canadian context. Do those in your church know the meaning of the phrase, "We are all treaty people"? And so this phrase, I think it's one of those fundamental phrases that everybody should know. And so the meaning that we are all treaty people, it's referring to the fact that we are all members of a nation that has signed agreement with another nation. And so whether you are a Canadian or whether you are First Nation, we are all signed the treaty. We are all descended from people who signed those treaties. And by the extension here, understanding what treaty rights are. A lot of people, when they think of the term treaty rights, they assume that only applies to Indigenous peoples of First Nations. And that's because those are the ones that are highlighted because those are the rights that have not been met. But really, non-Indigenous people have treaty rights as well. So the right to use land, the right to buy land, the right to move along the land. So with a treaty, you're giving something in exchange for something. And again, going back to that concept of Anishinaabe constitutionalism, it's the idea of mutual aid, of working together. So we all have treaty rights and we're all treaty people. And so I think that's a fundamental concept for reconciliation because it's describing what our relationship is, what it should be, and what it isn't. So I think that that's an incredibly important part of teaching for a Christian organization. So another piece that I'd like to touch on here is corporate culture. So, a lot of times in Christian ministries, we don't realize that as churches, we do have a corporate culture. A corporate culture is created when you just have a number of people together working on a common goal within a corporation or a legal entity. And so this applies to churches, this applies to organizations, it applies to denominational structures. They all have corporate cultures. And so the danger of not recognizing that you do have a corporate culture is that your corporate culture will be developed without your knowledge and without your guidance. And so same thing with a garden, like weeds will grow, terrible things will grow that you don't want. So you need to be conscious about your corporate culture. And so is your corporate culture part of the problem or is it part of the solution in the context of racism? And so there's two articles, or there's two resources that I'd like to share here. The one on the left is called Contact Theory in a Small Town Settler Colonial Context, The Reproduction of Laissez-Faire Racism and Indigenous White Canadian Relations by Jeffrey S. Dennis. So for me, this is probably one of my favorite articles that I've read. And Jeffrey S. Dennis actually has a new book that just came out that's called Canada at a Crossroads. And a lot of the same ideas in this article is also present in the book. So he highlights what laissez-faire racism is. And so in the book, he highlights, well, first of all, he's talking about, he talks about group theory. So he starts off with this idea that if you have two different groups that are at odds with each other, the closer proximity that they have to each other and the more communication, etc., the more they will talk together, and that communication should resolve the conflict, and it should avoid the idea of difference and the idea of other. And so, but when he's exploring small town settler context where you have indigenous and non-indigenous peoples together, living together for generations, you don't see that. In fact, you see that the racism, the laissez-faire racism, continues, and it's perpetuated from generation to generation. And so his research is to explore the question of why is that? Why isn't that relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous people don't resolve these conflicts just by the very nature that these relationships exist? And so he came up with 3 different social processes that maintain laissez-faire racism, despite the fact of there being good relationships across either side. And so the first one was political avoidance norms. The second one was ideology-based homophily. And the third one was subtyping. And so political avoidance norms is the idea that if you are a First Nation person who doesn't talk about the political inequalities, you don't talk about treaties, you don't talk about reconciliation, then you're considered a good Indian, you know? So that's, if you avoid talking about politics, then, you know, and you make that a norm to avoid talking about politics, then that will perpetuate the stereotype very effectively across generations. And so when we're bringing that into our corporate culture, ask the question, is it okay to talk about treaties, about reconciliation, and the politics that affect the daily lives of indigenous peoples? Is it okay to talk about these things in your culture, in your organization, in your church? Second one is ideology-based homophily. So the idea that people with different, so first of all, homophily just describes the social process of, or the social phenomenon of people who are like each other tend to group together. So age-based homophilies, people of the same age tending to want to be friends, or hobby-based homophily, people with the same hobbies tend to want to group together. So ideology-based homophily is people with the same ideology, the same worldview, and the same opinions. And so here you could find indigenous and non-indigenous people who are thinking the same in terms of, you know, reconciliation, or who would be against reconciliation, that kind of a thing. So it might be relationship across ethnicities, but not across ideologies. And so then, if we recognize that this is a social process that perpetuates laissez-faire racism, then if we were going to apply that to your corporate culture, then one of the questions you can ask is, are relationships across ethnicities and ideologies supported and encouraged? The last one that was talked about in the article, subtyping, essentially that means that, you know, do you have a separate category for people that break your stereotype? For example, if your stereotype is that all indigenous people are uneducated and they're not smart, etc., then if you find an educated indigenous person, you give them the subtype of the smart Indian, rather than seeing them as an example of how your stereotype was wrong to begin with. And so yeah, so just to say what the third process was. So for this third point, though, I want to mention this question: do all ethnicities share the burden of learning about each other's socio-cultural norms. So this is written very clearly in chapter 7 of the book Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell. And so I really recommend this book for those who have not read it yet. It's a fantastic book it's like an introduction to all things Indigenous, you know, like down from what terms do I use and what's the difference between First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, all the things. It's a really good book that encapsulates an introduction to all the different things that an Indigenous person might want to say to a non-Indigenous person. So it's a very good starting point for people to read. I highly recommend it. But in chapter 7, she talks about the burden that Indigenous people or people of color feel when they're interacting with people that have no idea about their culture. So in chapter 7, she talks about Inuit people, you know, coming down in urban areas. All the urban people expect her to know everything about you know, urban Canadian life and what the social cultural norms are, what's expected, but nobody knows the difference between the different types of Inuit people, the languages that they share, their own social cultural norms. And so if she breaks a social cultural norm, it's her fault. The burden is on her. Whereas what should be the case is everybody equally shares the burden of learning about each other's cultures, about each other's norms, and it's not placed on the outliers to be the ones to do the learning. And so I think that if asking that question, do all ethnicities share that burden? I think that can solve a lot of problems. You know, when I'm sitting with pastors or with boards, and you know, the common question is, yeah, I have this person in my church, and she's not fitting in, and keeping to themselves, and not feeling included. You know, so is this? It's an example of, you know, your person on the outside expecting to blend into your corporate culture and subscribe to all your rules. So of course that's going to be uncomfortable. And so recognizing that everyone needs to work together to make sure everyone feels comfortable is it's very important in any corporate culture, whether you're talking about a church or an organization or yeah, anything to that effect. And so programs. So here's a really good quote that I liked. It's that which you do for me, without me, you do to me. So I'll read that again. That which you do for me, without me, you do to me. And so this is a really great way of just explaining what self-determination is and why it's so important. And so if you look at call to action number 61 and UNDRIP Article 3 and 4, the call to action 61 is actually in reference to community-owned programs and community-directed programs, where if you know, if a church or organization is getting behind a program, how is it that Indigenous people are leading it? And UNDRIP Articles 3 and 4, they talk about the extreme importance of self-determination. And the reason why that's important is because throughout history, the self-determination of Indigenous nations has been constantly under attack. And so when we are doing our programs, even down to, you know, the smallest program, the smallest level, is to make sure, you know, asking that question, how are Indigenous people leading this? And I'm just noticing another comment here from Catherine. She says, I have found learning more about treaties incredibly helpful and inspiring, and I still have a lot to learn. I'm wondering how this might shape or affect relationships with Indigenous peoples who did not sign on to treaties, like the Métis or Dakota and Treaty 1 territory. What do you think we can do to celebrate and live out the treaties in the spirit and intent, without unintentionally excluding some Indigenous communities? Or is this too literal an approach to treaties? No, that's a great question. Fantastic question, because one of the problems here is that a lot of times there's a pan-Indigenous approach to explaining treaties. So the idea that all Indigenous people are the same and that they've all signed treaties, it's really important to recognize. For example, yeah, like the Métis did not sign a treaty. The Dakota in Treaty One, they did not sign a treaty. People on the West Coast, a lot of BC people living in BC, they did not sign a treaty. So think about that for a second. Like if you actually look at a map of the numbered treaties, and if you look at those who have not signed any of the number treaties or the pre-confederation treaties, such as the Robinson treaties, if you were to map all of those areas that have no treaties, then ask yourself the question: is that really Canadian territory? You know, is our Canadian map really accurate? You know, and so I don't think that it's too literal an approach. I think that, you know, the treaties, the reason why I bring that up a lot is because it's a great framework for those nations for whom it's important, but also to recognize, yeah, you have nations that have not signed treaties, and so they're signing things such as which would be called modern treaties. The absence of treaties is just as important as treaties itself, because of all the things that a treaty communicates. And so when we're talking about reconciliation, nation to nation reconciliation, we're talking about all of that. And so there's no universal approach to fixing the relationship. There's a need to recognize the diversity. I heard a saying that if you have six different people, six different First Nation, six different Indigenous leaders in a room, you ask them to define self-determination, you might get 7 different definitions, you know? So it's really important to recognize the diversity. And I think that a really good quote that Dr. Aldridge shared yesterday was the idea that no First Nation wants dominion from sea to sea, right? It's self-determination, and the treaty lens or lack thereof is a good way of looking at that. This other comment here from Kolisnik to everyone. Métis people are always struggling to not be the forgotten people, but we do have the Louis Riel gene, so we are still here, and sorry, so we are still here, and we'll continue to work to be self-determining. We're not offended, and keep on going. That's awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for sharing that. And then from Gwen, before developing a new program, helpful for us to remember, if we don't see it, we can think it doesn't exist, especially if we live in a different economic strata. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so you're looking at these points here. So are Indigenous peoples leading programs meant to support Indigenous peoples? And before developing a new program, check to see if Indigenous people in your area have already developed one. Are your resources better spent supporting their efforts and initiatives? And so I think that's really important, because there are a lot of Indigenous run organizations, charities, parachurch organizations that can really use help and can really use support. So it's really good to do that work. And sometimes it does take work. You have to really build your networks, and you have to look around, and it could be hard to find, but absolutely there are Indigenous organizations that are struggling, you know, and it'd be good to find them and to support them. And even if it's non-Christian, not a Christian organization, just have a look at, you know, here within Manitoba, for example, we have the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. We have, which is representative of the 63 First Nations in Manitoba. We also have MKO, Manitoba Kiwatinoe Okimaknak, which is representative of the Northern First Nations. Southern Chiefs Organization, which represents the Southern Chiefs. You also have the MMF, the Manitoba Métis Federation, and you know, so just looking at these different organizations and figuring out what are these organizations doing, and you know, because it can be a great opportunity for a church to partner with one of these organizations, one of these political organizations. It generates goodwill, which is really necessary at this particular time in history. Sheila Cook says, resurgence and reconciliation, Indigenous settler Indigenous Settler and Earthly Teachings by Ashburrows and Tully is another excellent resource for learning the basis of treaty, temporal priority. Thank you, Sheila Cook, Treaty 6. Yep, thanks for sharing, Sheila. Murray says, the 90 or so organizations in Winnipeg welcome partnerships, and any group can join the Urban Indigenous Accord run by the city of Winnipeg. Yes, that's a really good program to mention. Winnipeg's Indigenous Accord is basically an accord that holds, it gives the opportunity for churches and businesses and organizations to pick one of the 94 calls to action and to publicly report on what they're doing in response to the 94 calls to action. And so because it stems from the recognition that these 94 calls to action, they're not part of any legislation, therefore they're not binding, they're nothing more than suggestions at the moment that requires the goodwill of people to actually act on them. So this is a different approach than the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples in '96, where they set out a 20-year plan for the government to follow. Instead, with 94 calls to action, it's based off of people to publicly state what they're going to do and then to follow it. And so Winnipeg's Indigenous Accord is a great opportunity to do that. So yeah, if anyone has not signed on to the Accord, I would highly recommend joining on it and signing it. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Marie. So yeah, so just winding down to the end here, I'm going to conclude by talking about how to address racism on a personal level. And so when we're talking about institutional racism in a church or just racism in a church, really what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, any organization, church, it's a collection of people, it's a collection of individuals. And so I'm sharing a bit of a spectrum here in terms of how you would approach handling a difficult conversation about race with an individual. So I would start by really recommending this book here. It's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So it's really great for understanding why it's so difficult to bring up conversations about race. And so the book White Fragility, it talks about this idea that the quote unquote fragility is it's sort of like the emotional ability to handle difficult conversations as they relate to race. And so this a person's emotional integrity could break down really easily because they'd be sensitive to things like being called a racist, for example, or being accused of racism. And why are they so sensitive to that? This book really talks about the details of why that's the case. And so it gives you a heightened idea of what this fragility is. So now, after reading the book, there's a spectrum in terms of how you apply that to an actual conversation with an individual that you need to have about race. On the left side of the spectrum, it's concern for emotion. So on this side, you're recognizing the quote unquote fragility. And on the right side, it's concern for change. And so here you are addressing the quote unquote fragility. So on the left side, it's going to require a good amount of time. The risk, though, is that you're not going to be understood due to all the indirect language that you're using and due to all the concern that you're giving for the person's emotions. On the right side, the flip side, it really requires that person to be open to having a hard and direct conversation. And the risk here is the risk of not being understood, but this time due to heightened emotions. So on the one side, you risk losing your message and being too too sensitive to their emotions, and then on the right side, it's like, no, you're not sensitive enough, and now things spiral out of control, and the conversation doesn't go anywhere. So which end of the spectrum is the best? I actually don't know. This is something that in all the different situations that I found myself, like I'm a teacher, I'm a consultant, but at the same time, I'm also like an Indigenous individual who has to just do this myself with friends, family on a regular basis. And so it's part of me even figuring out like what's the best way. Like I've seen on the left-hand side where things have gone well, and took incredible amount of time, but also I've seen where it just doesn't go anywhere, you know, but it's a huge amount of time that's invested, but no success. And on the right hand side, where people just go in guns blazing and say what they need to say, I've seen that fail as well too. And I think that you know, intellectually, I think that a person of color, a Black person, an Indigenous person, I think that they should be able to have their conversations frankly and directly. Like, so practically, so just speaking from that way in terms of what should happen, they should be able to be on the right-hand side of the spectrum. But practically speaking, like if you actually want results, you actually want to change minds and change hearts, then the left hand of the spectrum might get more results. But does it? I actually haven't seen a whole lot of qualitative or quantitative research on that just yet. But me personally, I tend to be on the left-hand side. I tend to try to be more conscientious of the person's feelings and take my time and that kind of a thing. But what's the correct approach? I'm not sure. But hopefully the spectrum is useful for you know, just for sorting out like where to start. Aubrey says, that sounds like a work of self-awareness, not just of white privilege, but of our basic humanity and how we build relationships. Absolutely, great point. There's something called, I think it's the Johari window, the known self, the self that's known to ourselves, but not to others, the self that's known to others, but not to ourselves, like that whole window. Like, I agree, like this is part of that, right? Becoming self-aware, and the more self-aware we are, the better we can have relationships with others. So yeah, thank you, Aubrey. And then the last two slides here, right quickly, just talking about conflict resolution. So as you are engaging in conflict and difficult discussions about race, just have a path, you know, because especially if we're talking about the left side of where there's concern for emotion, there's a risk for you to have tons of conversation, but not really go anywhere. So here's a path, you know, an example of a path. So first, understand the conflict, make sure that it's defined on either side. Second is communicate with the opposition to keep the lines of communication going. The moment you cut off communication, you cut off any hope of rebuilding the relationship. 3, brainstorm possible resolutions. 4, choose the best resolution. 5, use a third-party mediator. 6, explore different alternatives. And 7, cope with stressful situations and pressure tactics. So this is just, you know, this is just an example that I quickly pulled off the internet online. The only point that I want to make with this is just say, like, actually have a plan, you know, like don't just go in there and just talk and talk and talk, but have a plan, have a chart, and make sure that you're actually moving things along. And have a plan when you're having this discussion. I think that it's, yeah, so that's really important. And the last slide here is active listening. So actually, you know, make sure that you're practicing active listening. Make sure that you're listening to understand. Don't just mentally prepare for a rebuttal. Wait for the speaker. Wait until the speaker is finished speaking. Be conscientious of your body language. Make sure your posture is open and interested. Take notes. Ask clarifying questions. Paraphrase what you think you've heard and give opportunity for clarification. Defer judgment. And treat other person the way that you'd want to be treated. So again, this is something that you can easily just Google this and throw this on, but it's so important. Like, even in, it's easy. The thing about this is it's easy to know this. It's easy to find it. You can just Google it and you could find conflict resolution resources, active listening resources, and so on. The challenge here is actually applying it when you're in the middle of it, and when you're feeling, when your emotions are heightened and everybody's in the room, to actually practice this of waiting until the other person is finished speaking. It's incredibly difficult, but actually making sure that when you are engaging in conflict, that you're doing it right. And another thing to recognize here is that conflict can be good. You know, like when you are engaging with, for example, Indigenous ministries, Don't expect that even if you're going in with the best intentions that you're not going to handle conflict. Like, you probably will. It's part of the learning experience, and it's part of growing. And I think that conflict should be seen as an avenue to growth, both for the organization, but also letting the relationship grow. So conflict should be seen in a positive light. And I know that some problems is that some organizations see conflict as something to be avoided at all costs. And I think that that's not a good approach. There should be an equal willingness to engage in conflict as a means of growth, and to do it constructively and to do it properly, because it's really uncomfortable, but to come on the other end of a conflict where you've learned and you've grown, there's nothing better than that kind of a feeling, and yeah, like I said, it's a great way to learn. And yeah, I think, yeah, I'm just going to leave that there, just for the sake of time, just open up for some questions. So reading some comments here. So Mary showed like the Johari window is a great visual tool for self-awareness. Yeah, should be okay. Then Johari window. Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. Murray says, I appreciate the sharing circles and the method of using the feather or a stone to pass along so one person speaks and you travel around the circle. Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference between sharing circles and healing circles. Sharing circles is like exactly one person speaks at a time, and it could be a very useful tool for conflict, and or even just getting to know each other. Like with circles for reconciliation, those are all based on the model of sharing circles, and it's where you pass a stick from person to person. But yeah, absolutely. And a healing circle is the same way. It's more focused on healing, and you're more careful about who's involved and that type of a thing. Joe Lopez says, thank you for your good words. Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate that. Thank you for being here. Mary Holman says, a great resource is Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. Thanks so much for sharing, Mary. Susan McPherson says, it's good to start with a personal reconciliation for each and everyone is important. Many think that they don't need this and that it is just the Indigenous people who need help, but all are in need of unlearning and relearning. Also important is that it is a process. There is no one event, workshop, conference, or retreat that will in and of itself bring the healing. That's such a good point. It's really important. There's a poem that I wrote. It's a spoken word poem. It's called Dear Younger Me, an open letter to my younger self. And if you go to Reconciliation Thunder, you could find it. And basically what I'm doing is I'm talking about the need to decolonize your mind. And so decolonize meaning look at the effects of colonialism on my own mind, my ideology, how I see the world, and how I need to go through that step by step. And I think it's important not just for Indigenous people like me to decolonize my mind, but for everybody. And so I would recommend that if anybody has not seen that, check it out. But the concept is the same. Is just recognizing that we need to decolonize our minds and pursue reconciliation within ourselves to learn. Larry says, what is the difference between racism and bullying? I hear this term when a corporation comes into Indigenous territory without consultation. The difference between racism and bullying. I think it's a good question. I think they seem in, for Indigenous context, I think they seem almost synonymous in terms of their practical effect. I think that, yeah, when we look at the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or Call to Action 92, both of those have as their core action the right to respect the self-determination of Indigenous peoples and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And so, yeah, so when we're talking about institutional racism in the corporate sector, yeah, that's foundational to recognize the Indigenous people's right to self-determination. Vincent, he says, great resources from the Canadian Council of Churches, and there's a link there. So thanks so much for sharing that link, Vincent. Susan says, also from the Canadian Council of Churches, is deeper understanding of intercultural ministry. Great. Thank you for sharing. And Gwen says, starting from the relationship between sin and racism as being about individual behavior, is it difficult to connect it to systemic racism? Is a theology of collective social sin useful in that work? That's a very interesting question. Starting from the relationship between sin and racism as being about individual behavior, is it difficult to connect it to systemic racism? Is a theology of collective social sin useful? I would say so, because I think that it's actually, that's a really good question, because a lot of times people will think about, what does my individual sin got to do with people so far away from me that I will never meet? And so absolutely, collective and social sin, that's actually a really good idea. It's a really good way to beef that up and to take that discussion to the next level. The idea that our sins, collectively, have a much broader impact. And so, yeah, I think that's actually really insightful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I think, yeah, I think that seems to be our end of questions, Vince.
Wonderful. That sounds good. Yeah, I just actually forgot that I have this, and it is an excellent resource. Actually, it's a Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network, and examines white identity, power, and privilege. And in here, there's a article by Reverend Mark MacDonald, or the Right Reverend Mark MacDonald. "What's at Stake for Truth and Reconciliation" is his title. And it also has quite a number of Mennonite and United Church people, and all kinds of different denominations speaking there. That last point, I think, is really interesting thought. Theology of sin, and how that really impacts racism. I think, well, sin, of course, messes everything up, right? And I my brother, who is actually more blunt than I am, had a person say to him that isn't he glad that he, being a white person, was there to help him build a house, right? And if that wasn't for him, he would still be living, or if it wasn't for white people, he'd still be living in wigwams. And my brother actually called him a racist to his face. And the guy responded by saying, "I am not a racist. Do you know how many Indigenous friends I have?" And it's like, whoa. But it starts there, doesn't it? Like, there's that whole superiority, and it doesn't matter which ethnicity a person comes from. That feeling of superiority always seems to get in the way, and especially as Christians, I think. The European view of their own superiority in and against the Indigenous people, I think, led to a lot of things happening that shouldn't have happened or couldn't have happened if they had checked their privilege as well. Especially, I think, the racist missiology that came out of that whole superiority way of thinking. I was going to ask you, I'm not sure, we have 2 minutes. So I'm going to ask you this very important theological question. What do you think proper missiology is, if you take away racist missiology?
I think, yeah, there's lots of different layers to that. I think the most important thing is recognize what it isn't, right? Recognizing that what have we added to missiology over the years, the decades, and the centuries. Right. We listened to the story yesterday of the Dene being replaced, the CSA Dene. So many of them, they lost their lives because a missionary was complicit in their forced relocation, without giving them their food, the food supplies, and everything they needed, their animals, their dogs, and a lot of them died. And so, just as one very specific example, from the 1950s, and so recognizing that missiology is not aligning yourselves with any particular government. It's about looking at what is the essence of the gospel, and how do you bring people into relationship with God, with Creator, and how do you facilitate that? How do you facilitate that happening? And I think it's important. Like, we finished off our discussion yesterday on the interpretation of Scripture, and we talked about like the Hebrew, the alignment between Hebrew and indigenous interpretations and ways of knowing. I think that if you look at missiology, it's the same thing as how you look at hermeneutics. Like you look at what you want to do with proper hermeneutics is you want to look at you look at your source text, right? You're looking at what the text says, and you're bringing the core meaning across not only language, but also hundreds of 2,000 years, and also different cultures. And so you're trying to figure out, first of all, what's the core meaning, and how do you take that core meaning and represent it in your current culture and language and time. And so we do that. And so the core part of this is what's the final culture that you're landing that meaning in, and what are you setting it in. And so a lot of times we just think about our Canadian culture as the end result of where we're putting the meaning in. But also, even in indigenous, if you're bringing that core meaning if you're doing hermeneutics into an indigenous language, so you're doing the exact same thing. Like, why could you not take the same approach of what you're doing in Canada, in your Canadian English speaking context, and do it in a First Nation, for example, OG Cree speaking context? So you're looking at what is the core meaning of the Scripture. You're bringing it across 2,000 years into a present day, say OG Cree community, for example, translating it into OG Cree, and you're situating it into the OG Cree culture, and you're trying to take that individual meaning and bringing it across to the present day. So that's hermeneutics. And I think missiology is the same thing. It's the same process. The difference is you're taking the core message of the gospel, and you're doing the same thing. You're taking it from its original context, and you're translating it to the best of your ability into indigenous context.
Yeah, and a lot of that involves as well, decolonizing your mind and your own theology, right? Because even as Indigenous people, we've all been told that this is the proper theology, especially, the missiology that came, that was equated with civilization, conquest, land theft, assimilation, that kind of thing. And that, those things came part and parcel with the good news of the gospel. And so even talking about and looking at what is the institutional racism within the church, well, part of that is our theology. And I think that we need to seriously look into that and see, is that something that still very much affects the way in which we present Jesus to people, especially to Indigenous people, I think.
So true. A lot of times the argument is you shouldn't add anything to the gospel, but really what we're doing is like, no, we're pointing out something has already been added. We're just taking it away,
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate it. And I was telling everyone before you came on that there were two reasons why I asked you to lead this part. One was because you're very knowledgeable, and especially I think in this area. But the other thing too is that you're not an Anglican, and that we Anglicans, I think, sometimes can hear more when a non-Anglican says something to us. And so thank you so much again for this, and I really appreciate that. We're going to take a supper break now from until 7 p.m. And then we'll have Dr. Ray Aldred back again, and his plenary this time will be on sacred land, sacred people, sacred covenant, treaty spirituality. So get your pens and paper ready, and let's see if we can grill him after his talk. Because Chris is not going to be with us tonight, so unfortunately, then we have to do it. Okay, thank you so much. You take care.